Commander Jake Morrison stood at his post on the bridge of the U.E.'s Valiant. He looked out at the massive fleet stretched across space before him. 9,900 ships floated in perfect formation, their lights blinking like stars against the darkness. This was the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. It was also their last hope. Jake had been in space for 15 years, but he had never seen anything like this. Ships from every human colony were here. There were massive battleships from Earth, sleek destroyers from Mars, and heavy cruisers from the outer colonies. Fighter squadrons buzzed between the larger vessels like busy insects. Each ship carried brave men and women who knew they might not return home. The aliens called themselves the Zephyrians. 3 years ago, they had arrived at the edge of human space without warning. Their ships were unlike anything humans had ever built. They moved with impossible speed, and their weapons could cut through the strongest human armor like it was paper. Their energy shields could stop every weapon humanity had tried to use against them. The first human colony to fall was new. Boston. Jake remembered watching the news reports with growing horror. The Zephyrian ships had appeared in the system and demanded immediate surrender. When the colonists refused, the aliens had destroyed every building, every ship, and every person on the planet. 3 million people died in less than an hour. After New Boston came Harmony Station, then the mining colonies of the asteroid belt, then the research outposts near Jupiter. Each time, the Zephyrians gave the same demand: surrender or die. Each time, humans chose to fight. Each time, they lost. The worst part was that the Zephyrians never explained why they were attacking. They never asked for territory or resources. They simply wanted all humans dead. Their messages were always the same cold words transmitted across space. Your species will be eliminated. Resistance is pointless. Surrender now, and your death will be quick. Jake touched the small photo taped to his command console. His daughter Amy smiled back at him from the picture. She was 8 years old and lived with her mother on Earth. The Zephyrians were only 6 months away from reaching the home system. If this mission failed, Amy would die along with everyone else on Earth. Commander Morrison, Admiral Carter wants to speak with all ship captains, said Lieutenant Bobby Chun from the communication station. Jake nodded and activated his display screen. Admiral Lisa Carter appeared on screens throughout the fleet. She was a tough woman in her 50s who had fought in every major conflict of the past 20 years. Her gray hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes were hard as steel. Jake had served under her before and knew she never gave up, no matter how bad things looked. Captains and crews of the human defense fleet, Admiral Carter began. Today we begin Operation Final Stand. I will not lie to you about what we face. Intelligence reports tell us that 90% of our ships will be destroyed before we reach our target. Most of you will not survive the next 6 hours. Jake saw some of his crew members look at each other with worried expressions. The bridge became very quiet except for the soft humming of the ship's systems. Carter continued. But here is what the Zephyrians do not understand about humanity. We do not calculate odds when our families are threatened. We do not surrender when faced with extinction. We fight, even when victory seems impossible. We fight because that is what humans do. The Admiral paused, and her expression became even more serious. Our mission is simple but deadly. We must reach the Zephyrian command station that orbits their home world. 18 ships, just 18, must get through their defenses and deliver our quantum torpedoes to that target. These new weapons are our only hope of penetrating their shields. Jake knew about the quantum torpedoes. Human scientists had worked day and night for 2 years to develop them. The weapons used exotic matter that could tear holes in space itself. But they had never been tested in real combat, and they required the ships to get very close to their target to be effective. Every ship that is destroyed will provide valuable data to the ships behind it, Carter explained. Every brave soul who dies today dies so that those 18 ships can complete their mission. Remember this. We are not just fighting for victory. We are fighting for the right of humanity to exist in this universe. The transmission ended, and Jake turned to face his crew. These people had served with him for 3 years. They had become like family to him. Navigator Lucy Adams was a young woman from the farming colonies who could plot a course through an asteroid field blindfolded. Engineer Danny Walsh was an old space veteran who could fix anything with spare parts and determination. Weapons Officer Rick Barnes had never missed a target in combat. Communications Officer Bobby Chun could maintain contact with other ships, even in the worst battle conditions. "You heard the Admiral," Jake said quietly. "We all knew this day would come. We all knew the odds when we volunteered for this mission. But look around you. Look at this fleet. Humanity has never assembled anything like this before. 9,900 ships, all crewed by people who refused to let our species die without a fight." Danny Walsh spoke up from his engineering station. "Commander, the engines are running at peak efficiency. We can maintain maximum speed for 8 hours if needed." Lucy Adams checked her navigation console. "Sir, I have plotted 17 different routes to the target. If our primary path is blocked, we can switch to alternates without losing time." Rick Barnes tested his weapon systems one more time. "All torpedo tubes loaded and ready, Commander. The quantum torpedoes are armed and waiting for your orders." Jake felt proud of his crew. They were scared. He could see it in their eyes, but they were ready to do their duty. This was what made humans special. They could be afraid and brave at the same time. The fleet began to move toward the jump point that would take them to the Zephyrian home system. Jake watched as the massive formation slowly turned and accelerated. Each ship left a trail of blue, light from its engines, creating a beautiful but deadly river of light flowing through space-dot. In 6 hours, most of these ships would be destroyed. In 6 hours, most of these brave people would be dead, but 18 ships would get through. 18 ships would deliver humanity's final blow against an enemy that thought humans were weak and cowardly. Jake thought about Amy again. She was probably in school right now, learning about history and mathematics and art. She lived in a world where she could play with friends and dream about the future. The Zephyrians wanted to take all of that away. They wanted to turn Earth into another dead world like New Boston. "All ships report ready for hyperspace jump," announced Bobby Chun. Jake opened a communication channel to the entire fleet. "This is Commander Morrison aboard the U.E.'s Valiant. I want every person in this fleet to remember why we are here. We are here because our children deserve a future. We are here because no alien race has the right to wipe out humanity. We are here because when faced with extinction, humans do not kneel down and wait to die. We stand up and fight back." The hyperspace engines of 9,900 ships activated at the same moment. Space twisted and bent around the massive fleet as they jumped toward the Zephyrian home system. Jake gripped his command chair as the ship shook from the yaw. Hyperspace transition. When they emerged from hyperspace in 6 hours, the real battle would begin. The Zephyrians would be waiting with their superior technology and their deadly weapons. Most of the human fleet would be destroyed in the first few minutes of combat, but Jake Morrison and his crew were ready. They had trained for this moment. They had prepared for this sacrifice. They carried with them the hopes and prayers of every human being in the galaxy that the U's Valiant raced through hyperspace toward destiny, carrying Commander Jake Morrison and his crew toward the greatest battle in human history. Behind them, 9,899 other ships followed, each one crewed by heroes who understood that sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything. The assault was about to begin. The moment the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace, the universe exploded around them. Commander Jake Morrison felt his ship shake violently as the UES Valiant emerged into normal space. On his tactical screen, he could see the Zephyrian home. Systems spread out before them like a deadly trap waiting to spring. The alien defense grid was bigger than anyone had imagined. Massive battle stations floated in space, each one the size of a small moon. Their dark metal surfaces bristled with weapon emplacements that glowed with deadly energy. Between the battle stations, smaller defense platforms created overlapping fields of fire that could destroy anything that tried to pass through. "My God," whispered Navigator Lucy Adams as she stared at her sensor readings. "There are over 300 major defense platforms. Our intelligence reports said there would be 50 at most." Jake gritted his teeth and opened a communication. Channel to his crew. "All hands, battle stations. This is what we came here to do. Remember, our job is to get those 18 ships through to the target, no matter what happens to us." The first wave of human ships had barely formed up when the Zephyrian weapons opened fire. Beams of pure energy lanced across space, each one powerful enough to vaporize a human destroyer in a single hit. The lead battleships, massive vessels that had taken years to build, simply disappeared in flashes of light. Captain Ryan Bell commanded the destroyer UES Defiance in the forward group. He watched in horror as the ship next to him was cut in half by a Zephyrian energy beam. The two pieces spun apart, trailing atmosphere and debris. Emergency beacons activated automatically, but there would be no rescue ships coming. "Evasive maneuvers," Ryan shouted to his helmsman. "Get us away from the main group before they target us." But there was nowhere to run. The Zephyrian fire was too accurate and too powerful. Ryan saw 3 more destroyers explode within seconds of each other. Their deaths lit up space like deadly fireworks, each explosion representing hundreds of brave men and women who would never go home. On the flagship, UES Liberty, Admiral Lisa Carter watched the tactical display with growing dread. Red symbols showing destroyed human ships were appearing faster than her tactical officers could count them. In the first 5 minutes of battle, over 800 ships had been lost. "Admiral, we have multiple hull breaches on decks 7 through 12, reported Lieutenant Sophie Martinez from her tactical station. The Liberty had been hit by debris from a destroyed cruiser, and damage control teams were fighting fires throughout the ship. "Seal those sections and keep us moving," Carter ordered. "Signal all ships to implement attack pattern Delta. We need to spread out the formation before they destroy us all." Attack pattern Delta was a desperate strategy that scattered the human fleet across a wide area. It meant that ships would lose the protection of group defensive fire, but it also meant the Zephyrians could not destroy large numbers of vessels with single attacks. Commander Jake Morrison received the order and immediately turned the Valiant toward a gap between 2 Zephyrian battle stations. He knew it was probably a trap, but staying with the main group meant certain death. At least this way, his ship might survive long enough to be useful. "Danny, I need more power to the engines." Jake called to his chief engineer. Danny Walsh was already working frantically at his console. "I can give you 20% more, Commander, but the engines will start overheating in 30 minutes. After that, we might lose propulsion entirely." "Do it," Jake replied. 30 minutes is longer than most of us are going to live anyway." The Valiant accelerated toward the gap, her engines glowing brighter as Danny pushed them beyond their normal limits. Around them, other human ships were trying the same desperate maneuver. Some made it through the gaps in the defense grid. Others were caught by crossfire and destroyed before they could reach safety. Behind them, the main battle was turning into a massacre. The Zephyrian weapons were too advanced and too powerful for the human ships to fight effectively. Energy beams. That could destroy a human battleship would barely scratch the paint on a Zephyrian vessel. Human weapons that took direct hits on alien ships simply bounced off their energy shields without causing any damage, but the human crews kept fighting. They fired their weapons even when they knew it was useless. They maintained formation even when their ships were burning around them. They followed orders even when those orders were sending them to certain death. Captain Ryan Bell found himself in command of a small group of destroyers that had survived the initial attack. His own ship was badly damaged, with half his weapons offline and his shields failing, but he was still alive and still fighting. "All ships, this is Bell," he transmitted to the other surviving destroyers. "We cannot fight these battle stations directly, but we can draw their fire away from the main assault force. Follow me in." Ryan led his small group of ships in a suicidal charge toward the nearest Zephyrian battle station. He knew they could not destroy it, but every second the aliens spent shooting at his ships was a second they were not shooting at someone else. The Zephyrian battle station turned its massive weapons toward the attacking destroyers. Energy beams reached out across space like the fingers of death. The first destroyer exploded immediately. The second managed to fire a full spread of torpedoes before it was vaporized. The third ship rammed the battle station's shield generators at full speed, creating a brilliant explosion that lit up half the solar system. Ryan's ship, the Defiance, was the last one left. His engines were failing and his weapons were offline, but he still had one card to play. "All hands, abandon ship," he ordered. "Set the reactor to overload. We are going to take this battle station with us." The crew of the Defiance ran for the escape pods as Ryan guided his dying ship toward the alien battle station. The Zephyrians fired everything they had at the approaching destroyer, but it was too late. The Defiance crashed into the battle station's main reactor, just as her own power plant went critical. The explosion was visible from the other side of the solar system. The massive Zephyrian battle station broke apart like a toy, its debris spinning away in all directions. Ryan Bell and his crew had traded their lives for one small victory, but it was a victory that other human ships could build on. All across the battle zone, similar acts of heroism were taking place. Human ships that were too damaged to fight effectively were ramming Zephyrian platforms. Crews were staying at their posts even when their ships were coming apart around them. Fighter pilots were making attack runs against impossible odds, knowing they would never return, but hoping their sacrifice might help someone else succeed. Commander Jake Morrison watched the battle unfold on his tactical display as the Valiant raced toward the inner system. The human fleet was being destroyed, but not without cost to the enemy. The Zephyrian defense grid was taking damage, and gaps were starting to appear in their formations. "Commander, I am picking up a transmission from Admiral Carter," announced Bobby Chun from the communication station. Admiral Carter's voice crackled over the speakers, distorted by battle damage to the Liberty's transmission systems. "All ships, this is Carter. We have lost over half the fleet, but we are making progress. The outer defense ring is breaking down. Continue the advance. Remember, we only need 18 ships to reach the target." Jake looked at his crew. They had been through hell in the past hour, but they were still alive, and their ship was still fighting. Engineer Danny Walsh had somehow kept the overloaded engines running. Navigator Lucy Adams had plotted a course through the defensive fire that had kept them alive when dozens of other ships had been destroyed. Weapons Officer Rick Barnes had managed to damage 2 Zephyrian platforms with carefully aimed torpedo strikes. "How many ships do we have left?" Jake asked. Bobby Chun checked his sensors, and his face went pale. "Sir, I count approximately 1,500 ships still operational. We have lost over 8,000 vessels. 8,000 ships destroyed. That meant over 500,000 people were dead or missing." The cost of this assault was higher than anyone had imagined, but they could not stop now. Too many people had already died for the mission to fail. The Zephyrian fighters were swarming around the surviving human ships like angry insects. These small alien craft were fast and deadly, armed with phase weapons that could slice through human armor like it was made of paper. Human fighter pilots tried to engage them, but the alien technology was too advanced. Lieutenant Sophie Martinez, who had somehow survived when the Liberty was destroyed, found herself commanding a small group of human fighters. Her own ship was damaged and running low on fuel, but she refused to retreat. "This is Martinez to all fighters," she transmitted. "We cannot match their speed or firepower, but we can use their tactics against them. Stay close to the capital ships and use them as cover. Make the Zephyrians come to us." It was a desperate strategy, but it worked. The human fighters used the larger ships as shields, popping out to take quick shots at the alien craft before ducking back into cover. They could not win a direct fight, but they could slow down the enemy advance and buy precious time for the assault ships to reach their target. The battle raged on as the surviving human ships pushed deeper into the Zephyrian home system. Every minute brought new casualties and new acts of heroism. 2 hours into the battle, the space around the Zephyrian homeworld had become a nightmare of destruction. Floating debris from thousands of destroyed ships created deadly obstacles that moving vessels had to avoid. The wreckage of human battleships drifted alongside the remains of Zephyrian defense platforms, creating a graveyard that stretched across millions of miles. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Hughes Valiant, watching his tactical display with growing concern. Of the original 9,900 ships that had started the assault, only 300 remained operational. The human fleet had paid a terrible price to reach this point, but they were still far from their target, the Zephyrian Command. Station hung in orbit around the alien homeworld like a dark star. It was larger than any human space station, its surface covered with weapons and defensive systems that had never been successfully attacked. Intelligence reports said it controlled every Zephyrian military operation across the galaxy. If they could destroy it, the entire alien war machine would collapse. "Commander, we are receiving a transmission from the surface," announced Communications Officer Bobby Chun. "Admiral Carter is still alive." Jake felt a surge of relief. The flagship Liberty had been destroyed an hour earlier, and everyone assumed the Admiral had died with her ship. But Lisa Carter was too tough to die easily. Carter's voice came through the speakers, transmitted from an escape pod that had somehow made it to the planet's surface. "All surviving ships, this is Admiral Carter. I know the odds look impossible, but we are closer to victory than you think. The Zephyrian defense grid is breaking down. Their command structure is in chaos. Keep pushing forward. Around the Valiant." The surviving human ships continued their desperate advance. These vessels were battered and scarred from hours of combat. Most had lost weapons, engines, or life support systems. Many were held together by emergency repairs and the determination of their crews. Commander Kate Johnson led a squadron of heavy cruisers toward a cluster of Zephyrian battle stations. Her flagship, the UES Ranger, had lost half its armor plating and was venting atmosphere from dozens of hull breaches. But Kate refused to retreat. "All ships, this is Johnson," she transmitted to her squadron. "We cannot win a direct fight with these battle stations, but we can take them with us. Prepare for ramming speed." The other cruiser captains understood immediately. Their ships were too damaged to be effective in normal combat, but they could still serve as weapons. One by one, the heavy cruisers accelerated toward the Zephyrian platforms, their crews evacuating to escape pods at the last possible moment. The first cruiser, the Hughes Boston, struck a battle station at full speed. The impact tore both vessels apart in a brilliant explosion that could be seen from orbit. The second cruiser, the U.E.'s Denver, managed to penetrate a battle station's shields before its reactor went critical, destroying the alien platform from the inside. Kate Johnson's ship, the Ranger, was the last to make its attack run. She had stayed on the bridge longer than the others, making sure her ship stayed on target. As the Zephyrian battle station grew larger in her view screen, she thought about her home on Mars and the family she would never see again. The Ranger struck the battle station with tremendous force. The explosion lit up space for thousands of miles in every direction. When the light faded, both the human cruiser and the alien platform were gone, leaving only expanding clouds of debris. But Kate Johnson's sacrifice had opened a gap in the Zephyrian defense line. Other human ships immediately moved to exploit the opening, racing through the gap before the aliens could close it. The Zephyrians were learning to fear human tactics. Their advanced computers had never encountered an enemy that fought this way. Most species in the galaxy surrendered when faced with overwhelming odds. They calculated losses and made logical decisions about when to retreat. Humans were different. They kept fighting even when victory was impossible. They turned their own ships into weapons when their guns stopped working. They smiled while piloting, damaged vessels into enemy positions, treating certain death as just another part of the mission. The alien commanders began to hesitate. Their tactical programs had no data on how to fight an enemy that refused to follow logical patterns. Some Zephyrian ships started pulling back from the most dangerous positions, trying to avoid the suicidal human attacks. Lieutenant Sophie Martinez had somehow managed to keep her fighter squadron together despite losing most of her original pilots. She now commanded a mixed group of fighters and bombers from different ships, all of them damaged but still capable of fighting. "Listen up, people," she transmitted to her pilots. "We cannot match their technology, but we can outthink them. The Zephyrians fight like machines. They follow patterns and stick to their programming. We are going to be unpredictable." Sophie led her fighters in attacks that made no tactical sense, but somehow worked. They would retreat when the enemy expected them to advance, then suddenly turn and strike when the aliens thought they were running away. They used destroyed ships as cover, hiding among the wreckage until Zephyrian fighters came close enough to ambush. The strategy was working. Zephyrian fighter losses were mounting as human pilots found ways to turn their weaknesses into advantages. Sophie's squadron was taking casualties, but they were also clearing the way for the larger ships to advance. Engineer Danny Walsh was performing miracles aboard the Valiant. The ship's engines should have failed hours ago, but he had somehow kept them running with spare parts salvaged from other systems. When the main power conduits burned out, he rerouted power through the life support systems. When the cooling pumps failed, he jury-rigged a replacement using parts from the food processors. "Commander, I can give you 1 more hour at maximum power," Danny reported from the engine room. "After that, we will have to shut down the main engines or risk a core breach." Jake Morrison nodded grimly. 1 hour might be enough to reach the target, but it would not be enough to get home afterward. Not that going home had ever been part of the plan. Navigator Lucy Adams was tracking the positions of all surviving human ships on her tactical display. The fleet that had once numbered in the thousands was now down to individual squadrons scattered across the battle zone. But those squadrons were still moving forward, still fighting toward their objective. "Sir, I count 67 ships still advancing on the command station," Lucy reported. "The rest are either destroyed or too damaged to continue the attack." 67 ships from nearly 10,000. The casualties were beyond anything humanity had ever experienced in a single battle. But those 67 ships represented the toughest, smartest, and most determined crews in the human fleet. If anyone could complete the mission, it would be them. The Zephyrian command station was beginning to look worried. Jake could see increased activity around its defensive systems as the alien commanders realized that some human ships were actually going to reach their target. Energy weapons that had been firing at distant targets were being redirected toward the approaching human vessels. Weapons Officer Rick Barnes was down to his last 3 quantum torpedoes. These exotic weapons were humanity's only hope of penetrating the Zephyrian shields, but they had never been tested in actual combat. The scientists who built them were not even sure they would work. "Commander, the quantum torpedoes are armed and ready," Rick reported. "But we need to get within 5,000 kilometers of the target for maximum effectiveness. That means we have to get through their entire defensive perimeter." 5,000 kilometers was practically point-blank range in space combat. Most ships would be destroyed long before they could get that close to such a heavily defended target. But the quantum torpedoes would not work at longer ranges, so there was no choice. The surviving human ships began their final approach toward the Zephyrian command station. They flew through fields of defensive fire that could vaporize a battleship in seconds. They dodged between the wreckage of their own destroyed vessels, using the debris as cover whenever possible. Some ships did not make it. The UE's courage exploded when a Zephyrian energy beam hit her reactor. The UES Defiant was cut in half by defensive fire from the command station itself. The UE's Freedom lost power and drifted helplessly into a minefield, disappearing in a series of massive explosions. But other ships kept coming. They absorbed incredible amounts of damage and kept flying. They lost weapons, engines, and entire sections of hull, but their crews refused to give up. When one ship was destroyed, the others closed ranks and continued the attack. Commander Jake Morrison felt the Valiant shake as another energy beam passed close by. His ship was holding together, but barely. Half the bridge displays were dark, and he could smell smoke from fires burning somewhere in the lower decks. "Distance to target?" he asked. 15,000 kilometers and closing," Lucy Adams replied. "We need to get 3 times closer before we can fire the quantum torpedoes." The command station was growing larger on the main view screen. Jake could see its defensive weapons tracking his ship, preparing to fire. Around him, other human vessels were making the same desperate approach, their crews knowing that most of them would die in the next few minutes. But they kept flying forward, toward the target that represented humanity's last hope for survival. The final approach to the Zephyrian command station was a journey through hell. Commander Jake Morrison watched his tactical display as the 67 remaining human ships pressed forward through the most concentrated defensive fire any of them had ever seen. Energy beams crossed space like deadly lightning, each one powerful enough to destroy a human vessel with a single hit. The command station itself was a massive structure that seemed to go on forever. Its dark metal surface was covered with weapon emplacements, shield generators, and defensive systems that had been built over centuries. No enemy had ever gotten close enough to threaten it before, and the Zephyrians were determined to keep it that way. 10,000 kilometers to target, announced Navigator Lucy Adams, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We are entering the final defensive zone." The final defensive zone was exactly what it sounded like. Every weapon on the command station was now focused on destroying the approaching human ships. The space around them lit up with energy beams and explosive projectiles. Ships that had survived hours of combat were suddenly vaporized in brilliant flashes of light. Jake watched as the U's Normandy, a heavy cruiser that had fought bravely throughout the battle, took a direct hit from the command station's main gun. The ship simply disappeared, leaving only a cloud of glowing particles where it had been a moment before. 200 brave souls had just died in an instant. "Commander, we have lost main power to the forward shields," reported Engineer Ganny. Walsh from his post. "I can reroute backup power, but it will only last a few minutes." "Do it," Jake ordered. We just need to stay alive long enough to get within firing range. The U's Valiant shook violently as another energy beam passed close by. Jake could hear a sound of metal buckling somewhere in the ship's hull. His crew worked frantically at their stations, trying to keep their vessel operational for just a few more minutes. Around them, other human ships were facing the same desperate struggle. The UE's Phoenix lost her main engines and began drifting helplessly toward the command station's defensive grid. Her captain, Commander Steve Martin, made a quick decision. "All hands abandon ship," Steve ordered. "Set the reactor to overload. We are going to ram the nearest shield generator." The crew of the Phoenix evacuated to escape pods as their ship accelerated toward one of the massive shield generators that protected the command station. The Zephyrians tried to destroy the approaching vessel, but it was too late. The Phoenix struck the shield generator at full speed, just as her reactor went critical. The explosion was enormous. A shield generator was completely destroyed, and a section of the command station's protective barrier flickered and went dark. Other human ships immediately moved to exploit the gap, racing toward the weakened area of the station's defenses. Captain Ryan Bell had somehow survived the destruction of his original ship and was now commanding the destroyer UE's Justice. His vessel was badly damaged, with hull breaches on multiple decks and half his weapons offline, but he was still fighting. "All ships, this is Bell," he transmitted to the other surviving vessels. "The Phoenix has opened a hole in their shields. Follow me through the gap before they can repair it." Ryan led a group of 6 destroyers toward the damaged section of the command station's defenses. The Zephyrians were already working to restore their shields, but the human ships were faster. They slipped through the gap just as the protective barrier began to flicker back to life. Now they were inside the command station's final defensive perimeter. The massive structure loomed above them like a metal mountain, its surface bristling with weapons that tracked their every movement. But they were close enough now to use their quantum torpedoes effectively. "Distance to target, 5,000 kilometers, Lucy Adams announced. "We are within firing range of the quantum torpedoes." Jake felt his heart racing. After all the death and destruction, after all the ships lost and lives sacrificed, they had finally reached their goal. But as he looked at his tactical display, he realized something that made his blood run cold. Only 18 ships had made it through the final defensive barrier. 18 ships from the original fleet of 9,900. The casualties were even worse than Admiral Carter had predicted, but somehow, exactly the right number of vessels had survived to complete the mission. The 18 surviving ships spread out around the command station, each one positioning itself for the best possible shot. They had one chance to destroy the target. If the quantum torpedoes failed, there would be no second opportunity. Commander Kate Wilson commanded the heavy cruiser UES Liberty, named after Admiral Carter's destroyed flagship. Her ship had taken heavy damage during the approach, but her weapon systems were still operational. She spoke to her crew over the ship's communication system. "We have come farther than anyone thought possible," Kate said. "We have lost more friends than we can count. But we are here, and we have a chance to end this war. Make every shot count." Weapons Officer Rick Barnes on the Valiant was making final adjustments to his quantum torpedoes. These weapons used exotic matter that could tear holes in space itself, but they had never been tested against Zephyrian shields. The scientists who built them said they should work, but nobody really knew for sure. "Commander, all quantum torpedoes are armed and ready," Rick reported. "Target locks are solid. We are ready to fire on your command." Jake looked around his bridge at the crew that had served with him so faithfully. Danny Walsh had kept their engines running against impossible odds. Lucy Adams had navigated them through the deadliest space battle in human history. Bobby Chun had maintained communications when their equipment should have failed hours ago. Rick Barnes had saved his most powerful weapons for this critical moment. These people had become his family over the years they had served together. Most of them would probably die in the next few minutes, but they had accomplished something incredible. They had brought humanity's last hope to the enemy's most important target. All ships, this is Morrison. Jake transmitted to the other 17 vessels. We fire on my mark. Remember, we are not just fighting for ourselves. We are fighting for every human being in the galaxy. We are fighting for our children's future. The Zephyrian command station was trying desperately to destroy the 18 human ships before they could fire their weapons. Energy beams reached out across space, but the human vessels were too close and moving too fast. The station's own defensive systems were getting in each other's way as they tried to track multiple targets at once. Sophie Martinez had somehow managed to get her damaged fighter close to the command station. Her ship was falling apart around her, but she was still alive and still fighting. She could see the 18 larger vessels positioning themselves for their attack run. "This is for everyone we lost," Sophie whispered to herself as she watched. The final preparations. Captain Ryan Bell's destroyer was taking heavy fire from the command station's defensive guns. His ship was coming apart piece by piece, but he refused to retreat. "All power to weapons," he ordered. "We fire everything we have at that target." The other surviving ships were in similar condition. They were all damaged, all running on backup systems and emergency repairs. But they were still here, still fighting, still determined to complete their mission. Jake Morrison took a deep breath and opened a communication channel to all 18 ships. "This is Morrison to all vessels. We have traveled across the galaxy to reach this moment. We have lost friends, family, and shipmates, but we are here and we have a chance to save humanity." He paused, thinking about his daughter Amy back on Earth. She was probably sleeping now, safe in her bed, not knowing that her father was about to fight the most important battle in human history. Fire all quantum torpedoes. Fire for Earth. Fire for humanity. Fire for our future. 18 quantum torpedoes launched simultaneously from the surviving human ships. The exotic weapons streaked toward the Zephyrian command station, their energy signatures unlike anything that had ever been seen in this part of the galaxy. Each torpedo contained the hopes and dreams of an entire species compressed into a single weapon. The torpedoes struck the command station's shields in perfect synchronization. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The massive structure continued to hang in space, its weapons still firing at the human ship's dot, and the shields began to flicker. The exotic matter in the quantum torpedoes was having an effect that no conventional weapon could achieve. The energy barriers that had protected the command station for centuries were beginning to break down. Cracks appeared in the shield matrix, spreading across the protective barrier like fractures in glass. The Zephyrian technicians worked frantically to repair the damage, but it was too late. The quantum torpedoes had done something that no other weapon could do. They had found a way through the impenetrable shields. The shield barrier collapsed completely, leaving the command station defenseless for the first time in its existence. The massive structure was suddenly vulnerable to conventional weapons. Fire from the 18 human ships. "Shields are down," Rick Barnes announced with excitement in his voice. "The command station is exposed. All weapons fire at will." The 18 surviving human ships opened fire with everything they had left. The Zephyrian command station died like a giant beast, slowly and with great violence. Commander Jake Morrison watched from the bridge of the HFY Valiant as massive explosions tore through the alien structure. Each blast sent pieces of metal and machinery spinning away into space, creating an expanding cloud of debris around what had once been the most powerful military installation in the galaxy. The 18 surviving human ships continued to fire their remaining weapons at the dying station. Every torpedo, every energy beam, every missile they had left was aimed at the massive target. They could not afford to let it survive, not after the terrible price they had paid to get this far. Direct hit on their main reactor, announced Weapons Officer Rick Barnes with satisfaction in his voice. The entire central section is breaking apart. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. The mission was actually succeeding. After all the death and destruction, after losing over 9,800 ships, they had finally accomplished what they came here to do. The command station's death throes were visible from the planet's surface below. The alien civilians who lived on the Zephyrian homeworld looked up at the sky and saw their great fortress burning like a second sun. Many of them had never imagined that such a thing was possible. But the human victory was having effects that reached far beyond the homeworld itself. Throughout the Zephyrian Empire, military commanders were receiving reports that their central command had gone silent. The sophisticated computer networks that coordinated their entire war machine were suddenly cut off from their main control center. On distant battlefields across the galaxy, Zephyrian ships began to slow their attacks. Without orders from the command station, individual captains were unsure what to do. Some continued fighting on their own initiative, but others began to hesitate. The perfect coordination that had made the Zephyrian military so deadly was falling apart. Admiral Lisa Carter, still alive in her escape pod on the planet's surface, managed to establish communication with the surviving human ships. Her voice was weak but determined as she spoke to the crews who had accomplished the impossible. "This is Admiral Carter to all surviving vessels," she transmitted. "You have just changed the course of galactic history. The Zephyrian command structure is collapsing. Their ships throughout the Empire are losing coordination. You have given humanity a chance to survive." Jake Morrison felt proud of his crew and his ship, but the victory felt hollow. So many good people had died to reach this moment. He thought about Captain Ryan Bell, who had sacrificed his ship to help them get through the defensive grid. He remembered Commander Kate Johnson, who had rammed her cruiser into a battle station to open a gap in the enemy lines. Thousands of other heroes, whose names he would never know, had given their lives for this victory. "Commander, we are receiving signals from Zephyrian ships throughout the system," reported Communications Officer Bobby Chun. "Many of them are powering down their weapons. Some are actually broadcasting surrender messages." That was something nobody had expected. The Zephyrians had always fought to the death, never showing any sign of weakness or willingness to negotiate. But without their central command, individual ship captains were making their own decisions about whether to continue the war. Lieutenant Sophie Martinez, whose fighter had somehow survived the entire battle, found herself in an almost surreal situation. Zephyrian fighters that had been trying to kill her minutes earlier were now flying in formation beside her damaged craft. Their pilots were transmitting messages in broken human language, trying to indicate that they wanted to surrender. "This is Martinez to all human ships," she broadcast. "The enemy fighters are standing down. I repeat, Zephyrian fighters are powering down their weapons and requesting terms for surrender." The change was happening faster than anyone had imagined possible. Across the solar system, Zephyrian battle stations were going dark. Patrol ships were returning to their bases and shutting down their systems. The great war machine that had seemed unstoppable just hours earlier was grinding to a halt. Engineer Danny Walsh finally allowed himself to relax for the first time in hours. The Valiant's engines were still running, held together by emergency repairs and sheer determination. "Commander, I think we can actually make it home," he said with wonder in his voice. Home. Jake had not dared to think about going home during the battle. The mission had been designed as a one-way trip, with no expectation that any of the attacking ships would survive long enough to return to Earth. But now, With the Zephyrian resistance collapsing, there was actually a chance that some of them might live to see their families again. Navigator Lucy Adams was already plotting courses back to human space. "Sir, if we can get fuel and supplies from the surrendering Zephyrian ships, we should be able to make the journey home. It will take several months, but it is possible." The thought of seeing his daughter Amy again filled Jake with a joy he had not felt since the beginning of the war. But even as he imagined their reunion, he could not forget the price that had been paid for this victory. The casualty reports were still coming in, and the numbers were staggering. Of the 9,900 ships that had begun the assault, only 18 had completed their primary mission. Over 500,000 human military personnel had been killed or were missing in action. It was the largest loss of life in a single battle in human history. But those 18 ships had achieved something that would be remembered forever. They had proven that humanity could not be exterminated easily. They had shown the galaxy that humans would fight with incredible determination when their survival was threatened. Captain Ryan Bell, who had managed to survive in an escape pod after his ship was destroyed, was picked up by a Zephyrian rescue vessel whose crew was trying to surrender. The alien soldiers who found him treated him with a respect that bordered on fear. They had seen what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. "Why did you keep fighting when defeat was certain?" asked the Zephyrian captain through a translation device. "Your losses were enormous. Any rational species would have retreated." Ryan smiled grimly. "You do not understand humans very well," he replied. "We do not calculate odds when our children are in danger. We do not retreat when our species faces extinction. We fight until we win or until there are none of us left to fight." The Zephyrian captain was quiet for a long moment. His people had conquered dozens of worlds and defeated countless enemies, but they had never encountered anything like humanity's desperate determination. Throughout the Zephyrian Empire, similar conversations were taking place. Alien commanders who had thought humans were weak and cowardly were learning a hard lesson about what happened when Earth's children were threatened with genocide. News of the victory began to spread to human colonies throughout the galaxy. On worlds that had been preparing for Zephyrian attacks, people celebrated in the streets. Children who had lived in fear of alien invasion could finally sleep peacefully. Families that had been separated by the war began to hope for reunion. But the celebrations were mixed with mourning for the enormous losses. Every human colony had sent ships to join the great assault, and every colony had lost friends and family members in the battle. The victory had been purchased with blood, and nobody would ever forget the price that had been paid. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his damaged ship and looked out at the debris field that surrounded the destroyed command station. Somewhere in that wreckage were the remains of thousands of brave people who had given their lives for humanity's future. "Commander, we are receiving a transmission from Earth," announced Bobby Chun. "It is from the President of the United Earth Government." The President's message was broadcast to all surviving ships in the fleet. Her voice was filled with emotion as she spoke to the heroes who had saved their species. "To the brave men and women of the Human Defense Fleet," she began, "you have accomplished something that will be remembered for as long as humanity exists. You faced impossible odds and achieved victory through courage, determination, and sacrifice. The entire human race owes you a debt that can never be repaid." Jake thought about all the people who would never hear those words. They had died believing. They were fighting for humanity's survival, and they had been right. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. The war was over, but the aftermath would take years to sort out. The Zephyrian Empire was collapsing as individual worlds and fleets decided whether to surrender or try to continue fighting on their own. Most chose surrender when they learned what had happened to ships that faced human forces in battle. The 18 surviving ships began their long journey home. escorted by former enemies who now served as guides and translators. The trip would give the crews time to heal from their wounds and to process what they had experienced. Jake Morrison would see his daughter, Amy, again. He would hold her in his arms and tell her stories about the brave people who had died to keep her safe. He would teach her that freedom was not free, and that sometimes good people had to make terrible sacrifices to protect the things they loved. But he would also tell her that humanity had proven something important in the battle around the Zephyrian homeworld.